Hey everybody, I hope you're doing good. I am feeling good myself because school has ended and now I get to read whatever I want. I today am reading a book review by Christoph Fringeli of Jeffrey Herf's book, Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany, and the West German Far Left, 1967 to 1989. Christoph Fringeli has a few pieces that I've read out loud on this channel, and is I believe he's the main editor, the main guy behind the magazine Data Side, which is about politics and noise and dance music. And I'm going to read their little description of their Data Side project from their website. It says, Data Side is a magazine that covers experimental electronic music from the avant-garde to hard dance music. Its intersections with radical politics and counterculture, in-depth political and historical analysis and critique, as well as experimental fiction, poetry, and visual works. In each issue, there is an extensive record reviews section as well as detailed book reviews, comics, and news items. Dataside is not affiliated with or with any part. Dataside is not affiliated with or part of any specific political group, but engages in a revolutionary critique that rejects the historically discredited strains of leftism associated with social democracy and Leninism, drawing instead on the rich heritage of dissident Marxism, libertarian communism, and critical theory. Dataside is a critical voice in the increasingly irrational and rightward-lurching, quote, post-truth, end quote, times of conspiratorial worldviews and identity politics. God, just reading that description gets me excited. Wikipedia says Jeffrey Herf is an American historian of modern Europe, particularly modern Germany. He is a distinguished professor of modern European history at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm going to skip his biographical information, get to some of his work. Jeffrey Herf's 1984 book, Reactionary Modernism, Technology, Culture, and Politics in Weimar and the Third Reich, drawing on critical theory, in particular ideology critique, Herf coined the term, quote, reactionary modernism, end quote, to describe the mixture of robust modernity with an affirmative stance toward progress combined with dreams of the past, a highly technological romanticism, which was a current in the thinking of ideologues of Weimar's, quote, conservative revolution, end quote, and of currents in the Nazi Party and Nazi regime. Herf's subsequent books examine the political culture of West Germany before and during the battle over Euromissiles in the 1980s, memory and politics regarding the Holocaust in East and West Germany, Nazi Germany's domestic anti-Semitic propaganda, and Nazi propaganda aimed at North Africa and the Middle East, and the history of antagonism to Israel by the East German regime and West German leftist organizations from the Six-Day War in 1967 to the revolutions of 1989, the collapse of the European communist states, and German reunification in 1990. His published works include Reactionary Modernism, Technology, Culture, and Politics in Weimar and the Third Reich, War by Other Means, Soviet Power, West German Resistance, and the Battle of the Euromissiles. That's from 1991. Divided Memory, The Nazi Past and the Two Germanys, that's from 1997. The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust, that's from 2006. Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, from 2009. Undeclared Wars with Israel, from 2016. and Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 2022. He's edited the books Anti-Semitism Before and Since the Holocaust, Altered Context and Recent Perspectives, and Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism in Historical Perspective, Convergence and Divergence. He translated, this is one of the things that I've said this before, but Jeffrey Herf translated Alfred Schmidt's History and Structure, an essay on Hegelian Marxist and structuralist theories of history. And, where am I? Okay. So, let's get back to the text. One more thing. Shit. Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany and the West German Far Left, 1967 to 1989, is a book by Jeffrey Herf, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. The book argues that East Germany in particular was extremely hostile to Israel and waged, quote, undeclared wars, end quote, against Israel by funding militant Arab groups and other anti-Israel actions. The book received positive reviews for being well-researched and uncovering new information on East Germany's relationship with Israel. The content of the book says, this is from Wikipedia, the book discusses the period between the Six-Day War in 1967 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, chronicling such incidents as the Munich Massacre of 1972, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Kiryat Shmona, and Ma'alat terror attacks in Israel in 1975. The, quote, Zionism is racism, end quote, declaration of 1975. The Entebbe hijacking, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and attacks on theaters that screened Victory at Entebbe. In 1976, Lebanon War and West Berlin discotheque bombing in 1986. Herf's approach, in contrast to German historians who have examined the same subject, includes as sources Jewish victims of attacks. Herf also draws on extensive archive research in the SEDs, that's the Socialist Equality Party in Germany, or Socialist Unity Party, I think is what it actually is. Herf also makes an extensive archive research in the SED's Politburo, the GDR Council of Ministers, the GDR's Foreign and Defense Ministries, and elsewhere. According to Herf's research, the East German state sent 750,000 Kalashnikov assault weapons, 120 MiG fighter jets, 180,000 anti-personnel landmines, 235,000 grenades, 25,000 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and 25 million cartridges of various size, end quote, to countries and groups at war with Israel. Some of these went to the PLO, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Herf describes how East Germany funded Palestinian militant groups and West German radical leftists were trained by Fatah, the PFLP, and other groups to carry out attacks on Israeli targets. He also discusses the, quote, propaganda war against Israel, end quote, waged at the United Nations and other international organizations. Using anti-Israel actions, East Germany was able to obtain diplomatic recognition outside the Eastern Bloc from countries such as Iraq, Sudan, Syria, and Egypt. Herf finds that the East German government distinguished between, quote, moderates and, quote, extremists in the modern world. Quote, a, quote, extremist, end quote, was a terrorist who extended, quote, the international class struggle, end quote, to include attacks in Western Europe, while a, quote, moderate, end quote, was a terrorist from the Arab states or the Palestinian organizations who focused attacks only against Israel and perhaps, quote, imperialist, end quote, targets outside Western Europe, end quote, Jeffrey Herf. Herf notes that the difference between West Germany which had a, quote, 11th commandment, end quote, of doing no harm to Jews, and East Germany, which had no such premise. Herf praises the role of West German Jewish leader Heinz Galinsky, who wrote editorials denouncing anti-Semitism on the left. In contrast, Herf is critical of Willy Brandt because, quote, the West German chancellor who famously kneeled in an act of atonement at the memorial to the Jews killed in the Warsaw Ghetto declared his country to be neutral in the most dire days in Israel's history since 1948, the Yom Kippur War, end quote. Herf describes the essay of Ulrike Meinhof defending the Munich massacre as, quote, one of the most important documents in the history of anti-Semitism in Europe after the Holocaust, end quote. So, now that I've gotten some of this background out of the way, I can actually read the piece. Jeffrey Herf is this is the actual piece. This is Fringeli speaking now. Jeffrey Herf is history professor at the University of Maryland and has published extensively on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and political Islam. Undeclared Wars with Israel, 1967 to 1989, is Herf's latest book. At the core of Undeclared Wars with Israel is the ideological, economic, and military support for Arab dictatorships and the Palestinian nationalist movement by the government of the German Democratic Republic in the period between the 1967 Six-Day War and the end of the East German state in 1989/1990. Jeffrey Herf uses extensive research of the Stasi, GDR Secret Service archives, the official party press, documents from the United Nations, including the extensive reports by Israeli ambassadors regarding the territorial intrusions and massacres perpetrated by the PLO and its associated member groups in those years. This partially new research is embedded in a history of the relationship of the Soviet bloc with the State of Israel and the development of the struggle of Arab/Palestinian nationalists against Israel, whether through open warfare, shelling of Israeli cities across the border with rockets, guerrilla actions inside Israel, often consisting in massacres of civilians, or hijackings and murder in the international arena, or through diplomatic means on a bilateral level and often at the UN. Herf is broadening this research to cover the role of the West German far left in the context of these conflicts. The post-1967 radical left is portrayed here as radically anti-Zionist, if not anti-Semitic. Prominent examples after that time are people and organizations like Dieter Kunzelmann and Tupamaros West Berlin. It just says Dieter Kunzelmann, who lived from 1939 to 2018, as a German left-wing activist. The Tupamaros West Berlin were a small German Marxist organization which carried out a series of bombings and arsons at the end of the 1960s. In 1969, Dieter Kunzelmann, Georg von Rauch, and a few others traveled to Jordan to train at a Fatah camp, forming the Tupamaros on their return to Germany. The group took their name from the Uruguayan Tupamaros. The Tupamaros West Berlin had a core membership of about 15 people. The Tupamaros West Berlin action was an attempted bombing of West Berlin's Jewish Community Center on the 9th of November 1969, the anniversary of Kristallnacht. The bomb, supplied by the undercover government agent Peter Urbach, failed to explode. This was followed in the fall of 1969 by a number of bombings and arsons targeting police, judges, and U.S. and Israeli targets. The Tupamaros West Berlin claimed responsibility for these attacks under a variety of different names in order to exaggerate the size of their movement. The group was led by Dieter Kunzelmann and Georg von Rauch, and dissolved after the former, Dieter Kunzelmann, was arrested in 1970, and the latter was killed by police in 1971. The Tupamaros West Berlin's core members then formed the movement of the 2nd of June, while some others joined the Red Army faction. I'm going to assume you know who Ulrike Meinhof is and the RAF. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should look it up. Ulrike Meinhof. Ulrike Meinhof, who lived from 1934 to 1976, is a German left-wing journalist and founding member of the Red Army faction in West Germany, commonly referred to in the press as the Baader-Meinhof gang. Ulrike Meinhof is the reputed author of the Urban Guerrilla Concept, 1971. The manifesto acknowledges the RAF's, quote, roots in the history of the student movement, end quote, condemns, quote, reformism, end quote, as, quote, a break on the anti-capitalist struggle, end quote, and invokes Mao Zedong to define, quote, armed struggle, end quote, as, quote, the highest form of Marxism-Leninism, end quote. Meinhof, who took part in the RAF's May Offensive in 1972, was arrested in June of that year and spent the rest of her life in custody, largely isolated from outside contact. In 1974, Meinhof was sentenced to 8 years in prison for an attempted murder that had taken place during the RAF's successful jailbreak operation of Andreas Baader. From 1975, Ulrike Meinhof stood trial on multiple charges of murder and attempted murder with the 3 other RAF leaders, Baader, Gudrun Ensslin, and Jan Karl Raspe. Before the end of the trial, Ulrike Meinhof was found hanged in her cell in Stammheim prison. The official finding of suicide sparked controversy. 1 year later, on the 7th of April 1977, 2 members of the RAF assassinated the Federal Attorney General Siegfried Buback as revenge. The Revolutionary Cells were a self-described, quote, urban guerrilla, end quote, organization that was active between 1973 and 1995. The West German Interior Ministry described it as one of Germany's most dangerous leftist terrorist groups in the early 1980s. According to the Office of the German Federal Prosecutor, the Revolutionary Cells claimed responsibility for 186 attacks, of which 40 were committed in West Berlin. The Revolutionary Cells are known for the 1976 hijacking of an Air France flight in cooperation with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine External Operations, the PFLP-EO, and diverting it to Uganda's Entebbe airport, where the participating members were granted temporary asylum until they were killed by commandos of the Israeli Defense Forces during Operation Entebbe, a hostage rescue mission carried out at Entebbe Airport. The RAF Red Army faction, also known as the Baader-Meinhof group or Baader-Meinhof gang, was a West German far-left militant group founded in 1970 and active until 1998. The RAF described itself as a communist and anti-imperialist urban guerrilla group. The Red Army faction was engaged in armed resistance against what it considered a fascist state. Members of the RAF generally used the Marxist-Leninist term faction when they wrote in English. Early leadership included Andreas Bader, Ulrike Meinhof, Gudrun Ensslin, and Horst Mahler. The West German government considered the RAF a terrorist organization. The RAF engaged in a series of bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, bank robberies, and shootouts with police over the course of 3 decades. The RAF's activities peaked in late 1977, which led to the national crisis that became known as the, quote, German Autumn, end quote. The RAF has been held responsible for 34 deaths, including industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer and Dresdner bankhead Jürgen Ponto, federal prosecutor Siegfried Bubach, police officers, American servicemen stationed in Germany, as well as many cases of collateral damage such as chauffeurs and bodyguards, with many others injured throughout its almost 30 years of activity. 26 RAF members or supporters were killed. Although better known, the RAF conducted fewer attacks than the revolutionary cells, which is held responsible for 296 bomb attacks, arson, and other attacks between 1973 and 1995. The group was motivated by leftist political concerns and the perceived failure of their parents' generation to confront Germany's Nazi past, and received support from Stasi and other Eastern Bloc security services. On Wikipedia it says, dubious discuss. I have heard, I think in Jeffrey Herf's book, I might be wrong, I've heard him talk. I think he says that like part of the reason is that the RAF, in order to try, I think East Germany, in order to try to prove its like international appeal, made it a point not to fund terrorist groups left-wing terrorist groups in Germany. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's debated. Sometimes the group is talked about in terms of generations. The first generation consisted of Bader, Ensslin, Meinhof, and others. The second generation, after the majority of the first generation was arrested in 1972, the third generation, which existed in the 1980s and 1990s up to 1998, after the first generation died in Stammheim Maximum Security Prison in 1977. On the 20th of April 1998, an 8-page typewritten letter in German was faxed to the Reuters news agency signed RAF with the submachine gun red star, declaring the group had dissolved. In 1999, after a robbery in Duisburg, evidence pointing to Ernst Volker Staub and Daniela Klette was found, causing an official investigation into a refounding. One second. Alright, so back to the text. Alright, now that we've kind of established kind of all those big names, I think we can move on. One last thing. Sorry. The K grouping. It might be the K. I think that might be how you pronounce K in German, but I'm not sure. But for my purposes, it's going to say, you can just say the communist groups. It's a term referring to various Marxist, often Maoist organizations that sprang up in West Germany at the end of the 1960s following the collapse of the Sozialistische Deutscher Studentenbund. The K group included the Communist Party of Germany, Marxist-Leninists, KPD/ML, the Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands, Aufbauorganisation, KPDAO, the Communist League, KB, and the Communist League of West Germany. In 1971, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution estimated that Germany had around 20 active Maoist groups with 800 members between them. A few of these groups went on to join the Green Party, now Alliance 90/the Greens, in the late 1970s, while others eventually formed the Marxist-Leninist Party of Germany, MLPD. Okay. Now we can go back. This is the text now. Prominent examples at, the post-1967 radical left is portrayed here as radically anti-Zionist, if not anti-Semitic. Prominent examples after that time are people and organizations like Dieter Kunzelmann and the Tupamaros, West Berlin, Ulrike Meinhof, and the RAF, the revolutionary cells, and they're partaking in the hijacking of an alien Israeli plane to Entebbe, as well as examples of some so-called K groups. In my opinion, Herf, while accurately displaying dubious points in the history of the radical left in West Germany, fails to describe the often contradictory developments of some of these groups. For this reason, I divide this review into two parts. The first is the book review proper, while the second extends the discussion of the relationship of some of the groups on the West German radical left with both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in a way that goes far beyond the confines of a book review and hopefully offers additional insights. Okay, so part 1. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan for the British Mandate Palestine towards a two-state solution for an Arab and Jewish state next to each other. The two-state solution was rejected by the Palestinian nationalists as well as by the Arab countries, and the state of Israel was declared unilaterally. The next day, the combined armies of the neighboring countries attacked Israel with the intention of destroying the state and, quote, driving the Jews into the sea, end quote. The founding of Israel was initially supported and diplomatically recognized by the Soviet Union. A speech by Foreign Minister Gromyko, Gromyko, had previously affirmed the right of the Jewish people to a national homeland on the territory of the former British Mandate. Andrei Andreevich Gromyko, 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 1909 to 1989, was a Soviet politician and diplomat during the Cold War. Gromyko served as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1957 to 1985, and as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet 1985 to 1988. Gromyko was responsible for many top decisions on Soviet foreign policy until he retired in 1988. In the 1940s, Western pundits called him Mr. Nyet, or Mr. No, or Grim Grom because of his frequent use of the Soviet veto in the United Nations Security Council. Gromyko's political career started in 1939 in the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, renamed Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1946. Gromyko became the Soviet ambassador to the United States in 1943, leaving that position in 1946 to become the Soviet permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. Upon Gromyko's return to Moscow, Gromyko became a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and later First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He went on to become the Soviet ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1952. As Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, Gromyko was directly involved in deliberations with the Americans during the Cuban Missile Crisis and helped broker a peace treaty ending the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War. Under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, Gromyko played a central role in establishment of detente, I don't know how you say that, detent, with the United States by negotiating the ABM Treaty, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and the SALT I and II, among others. When Brezhnev suffered a stroke in 1975, impairing his ability to govern, Gromyko effectively dictated policy making alongside KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, Defense Minister Andrei Grechko, and Grechko's successor, Marshal Dmitry Ustinov. Even after Brezhnev's death, Gromyko's rigid conservatism and distrust of the West continued to dominate the Soviet Union's foreign policy until Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in 1985. Following Gorbachev's election as General Secretary, Gromyko lost his office as Foreign Minister and was appointed to the largely ceremonial post of Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Subsequently, Andrei Gromyko retired from political life in 1988 and died the following year in Moscow. Oh, that's Gromyko. Back to the text. A speech by Foreign Minister Gromyko had previously affirmed the right of the Jewish people to a national homeland on the territory of the former British Mandate. It was the weapons acquired from Czechoslovakia that proved instrumental for Israel to win the war. This is from Wikipedia. A Wikipedia titled "The Arms Shipment from Czechoslovakia to Israel." Between 1947 and 1949, the Jewish Agency, later to become the Israeli government seeking weapons for Operation Balak, made several purchases of weapons in Czechoslovakia, some of them of former German army weapons captured by the Czechoslovak army on its national territory, or newly produced German weapons from Czechoslovakia's post-war production. In this deal, sales activities of Czechoslovak arms factories were coordinated by a special purpose department of the Czechoslovak Metalworking and Engineering Works, holding so-called Secretariat D, headed by Jan Herman. The deliveries from Czechoslovakia proved important for the establishment of Israel. Back to the text. It was weapons acquired from Czechoslovakia that proved instrumental for Israel to win the war. Soon after, however, the Soviet bloc made a U-turn and began to regard Israel as part of the, quote, imperialist bloc, end quote. This change went along with an anti-Semitic turn in domestic affairs. This can be exemplified in the wave of the show trials in the last years of Stalin's rule, most notably the doctor's plot in the Soviet Union, a completely invented conspiracy claiming that a group of mostly Jewish doctors were plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders. Another group is the Slansky trial in Prague. Another example is the Slansky trial in Prague, where 17 members of the Communist Party, 11 of them Jewish, were accused of being involved in a Trotskyist, Titoist, Zionist conspiracy. Wikipedia says the Slansky trial was a 1952 anti-Semitic show trial against 14 members of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, including many high-ranking officials. Several charges, including high treason, were announced against the group on the grounds of allegedly conspiring against the Czechoslovak Republic. General Secretary of the KSC, Rudolf Slansky, was the alleged leader of the conspirators. All 14 defendants were found guilty of crimes that they did not commit. 11 of them were sentenced to death and executed. The remaining 3 received life sentences. So, back to the text. Another example is the Slansky trial. I'm not sure how you say it, if it's Slansky or Slansky. I think it's Slansky. In Prague, where 14 members of the I don't know. maybe it's Slansky, where 14 members of the leadership of the Communist Party, 11 of them Jewish, were accused of being involved in a, quote, Trotskyist, Titoist, Zionist conspiracy. 11 of the 14 were executed. These were just two out of many events that showed the emergence of a new anti-Semitic paranoia, which was given an anti-Zionist, quote, gloss, end quote, in the Eastern Bloc. After Stalin's death in 1953, overt anti-Semitism merged into an anti-Zionist consensus which remained in place until the breakdown of the Eastern Bloc, and now enjoys an afterlife in some sections of the international left. I would say many sections of the international left. This phenomenon became particularly virulent with events around and after the Six-Day War of 1967. After that event, the Eastern Bloc intensified its diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, as well as the regimes of Syria, Iraq, and other countries. These alliances have to be seen in the context of the Cold War constellation and the striving of the GDR, in particular for international diplomatic recognition. Indeed, by positioning themselves on the side of the PLO, the GDR gained diplomatic recognition from a number of countries. This helped to break the isolation caused by West Germany's Hallstein Doctrine. Wikipedia says, the Hallstein Doctrine, named after Walter Hallstein, was a key principle in the foreign policy of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, from 1955 to 1970. As usually presented, the Hallstein Doctrine prescribed that the Federal Republic would not establish or maintain diplomatic relations with any state that recognized the GDR, East Germany. In fact, the Hallstein Doctrine was more nuanced. There was no public official text of the doctrine, but the Hallstein Doctrine's main architect, Wilhelm Greve, explained it publicly in a radio interview. Konrad Adenauer, who served as Chancellor of Germany from 1949 to 1960, explained the outlines of the policy in a statement to the German Parliament on the 22nd of September 1955. It meant that the federal German government would regard it as an unfriendly act if third countries were to recognize the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, or to maintain diplomatic relations with East Germany, with the exception of the Soviet Union as one of the four powers responsible for Germany. The West German response to such could mean breaking off diplomatic relations, though this was not stated as an automatic response under the policy, and in fact remained the ultima ratio, last resort. The Federal Republic abandoned important aspects of the Hallstein Doctrine after 1970, when it became difficult to maintain, and the federal government changed its politics towards the GDR. The Four-Power Agreement in Berlin in 1971 and the signing of the Basic Treaty in 1972 brought an end to the doctrine in accordance with the new strategy of Ostpolitik. Back to the text. This helped to break the isolation caused by West Germany's Hallstein Doctrine, a policy designed to keep the Federal Republic of Germany from entertaining diplomatic relations with any country that recognized the GDR, which prevented many countries from doing so. But the GDR's alliances went deeper than merely tactical lip service. The GDR's alliances provided not only propagandistic but also logistical support, including weapons sales and deliveries. These, as Herf documents, reached substantial proportions, calling into question the often repeated argument by certain apologists for the GDR that at least the GDR prevented further wars from being waged on German soil. Not only were hundreds of thousands of Kalashnikov rifles and other weaponry exported, including rocket launchers and MiG fighter planes, these planes were also serviced by East German technical personnel. About 3,000 foreign military were trained in East Germany, including members of the PLO. There were also direct contacts to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, DFLP, the so-called left groups within the PLO. So the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, according to Wikipedia, is a secular Palestinian Marxist and Maoist organization. It also is frequently referred to as the Democratic Front or Al-Jabha al-Demokratia. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a member organization of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Alliance of Palestinian Forces, and the Democratic Alliance List. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was founded in 1968 by Nayef Hawatmeh, splitting from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It maintains a paramilitary wing, the National Resistance Brigades. The DFLP's declared goal is to, quote, create a People's Democratic Palestine where Arabs and Jews would live without discrimination, a state without classes and national oppression, a state which allows Arabs and Jews to develop their national culture, end quote. One of the attacks for which the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine is best known as the 1974 Ma'alat massacre, in which 25 school children and teachers were killed. Although the National Resistance Brigades have fighters based in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, these fighters have been engaged in relatively few military operations since the First Intifada, until the 2023 and 2024 Gaza War. And the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a secular Palestinian Marxist, Leninist, and revolutionary socialist organization founded in 1967 by George Habash. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine has consistently been the second largest of the groups forming the Palestine Liberation Organization, the largest being Fatah. Ahmad Sa'adat, who was sentenced in 2006 to 30 years in an Israeli prison, has served as General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine since 2001. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine currently considers both the Fatah-led government in the West Bank and the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip illegal because the elections to the Palestinian National Authority have not been held since 2006. As of 2015, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine boycotts participation in the PLO Executive Committee and the Palestinian National Council. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine has generally taken a hard line on Palestinian national aspirations, opposing the more moderate stance of Fatah. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine does not recognize Israel and promotes a one-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In a, quote, democratic Palestine, where, quote, Arabs and Jews would live without discrimination, end quote. The military wing of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is called the Abu Ali Mustafa Brigades. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is well known for pioneering armed aircraft hijackings in the late 1960s and early 1970s. According to PFLP Politburo member and former aircraft hijacker Leila Khaled, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine does not see suicide bombing as a form of resistance to occupation or as a strategic action or policy and no longer carries out such attacks. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine has been designated a terrorist organization by the United States, Japan, Canada, and the European Union. Back to the text. About 3,000 foreign military were trained in East Germany, including members of the PLO. There were also direct contacts to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the so-called left groups of the PLO. Recipients of this support were countries like Egypt and Syria, both countries who harbored many former Nazis, many of whom were in positions as advisors to military and government. Also supported was the Palestinian nationalist movement, whose historic leader, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, had been a German ally into the Second World War. I have a piece, it's about Husseini, but I'll read his thing here. Amin al-Husseini lived from 1897 to 1974, and was a Palestinian Arab nationalist and Muslim leader in the mandatory Palestine. Al-Husseini was the scion of the Al-Husseini family of Jerusalemite Arab nobles who traced their origins to the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Husseini was born in Jerusalem, Ottoman Empire in 1897. Husseini received education in Islamic, Ottoman, and Catholic schools. In 1912, Amin al-Husseini pursued Salafist religious studies in Cairo. Amin al-Husseini later went on to serve in the Ottoman army during World War I. At the war's end, Amin al-Husseini stationed himself in Damascus as a supporter of the Arab Kingdom of Syria, but following its disestablishment, moved back to Jerusalem, shifting his pan-Arabism to a form of Palestinian nationalism. From as early as 1920, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini actively opposed Zionism and, as a leader of the 1920 Nebi Musa riots, was sentenced for 10 years imprisonment but pardoned by the British. In 1921, Herbert Samuel, the British High Commissioner, appointed Amin al-Husseini Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a position Amin al-Husseini used to promote Islam while rallying a non-confessional Arab nationalism against Zionism. During the 1921 to 36 period, Amin al-Husseini was considered an important ally by the British authorities. Amin al-Husseini's appointment by the British for the role of Grand Mufti of all Palestine, a new role established by the British, helped divide the Palestinian leadership structure and national movement. In 1937, evading an arrest warrant for aligning himself as leader of the 1939 Arab revolt in Palestine against British rule, Amin al-Husseini fled and took refuge in Lebanon and afterwards Iraq. Amin al-Husseini established himself in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, where Amin al-Husseini collaborated with during World War II against Britain, requesting during a meeting with Adolf Hitler backing for Arab independence in opposition to the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Upon the end of the war, Amin al-Husseini came under French protection and then sought refuge in Cairo. In the lead-up to the 1948 Palestine War, Amin al-Husseini opposed both the 1947 UN partition plan and Jordan's plan to annex the West Bank. Failing to gain command of the Arab League's Arab Liberation Army, Husseini built his own militia, Holy War Army. In September 1948, Amin al-Husseini participated in the establishment of an all-Palestine government in Egyptian-ruled Gaza. But this government won limited recognition and was eventually dissolved by Egypt in 1959. After the war, the 1948 Palestinian expulsion and flight, Amin al-Husseini claims to leadership were discredited, and Amin al-Husseini was eventually sidelined by the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1964. Amin al-Husseini died in Beirut, Lebanon in July 1975. Amin al-Husseini was and remains a highly controversial figure. Historians dispute whether his fierce opposition to Zionism was grounded in nationalism or anti-Semitism, or a combination of both. Opponents of Palestinian nationalism have pointed to Husseini's wartime residence and propaganda activities in Nazi Germany to associate the Palestinian national movement with anti-Semitism in Europe. Historians have also note that Husseini was not the only non-European nationalist leader to have cooperated with Nazi Germany against Britain, citing examples of Indian, Lebanese, and even the Jewish militant group Lehi cooperation. That's Amin al-Husseini. Back to the text. Also supported was the Palestinian nationalist movement, whose historic leader, Haj Amin al-Husseini, had been a German ally in the Second World War. Nevertheless, the Soviet ambassador to the UN, Nikolai Fedorenko, quote, compared Israel to Nazi Germany and called for Israel's leaders to be put on trial as the Nazi leaders had been in Nuremberg. Wikipedia says Nikolai Fedorenko was a Soviet philologist, Orientalist, statesman, public figure, professor, and corresponding member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So back to the text. Nevertheless, in 1967, the Soviet ambassador to the UN, Nikolai Fedorenko, quote, compared Israel to Nazi Germany and called for Israel's leaders to be put on trial as the Nazi leaders had been in Nuremberg, end quote, Herf, a line that was soon enough parroted by Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader. Although it is particularly insidious and a feat of political pseudo-psychology to boot, to equate Zionism with fascism, one has to keep in mind that, ever since they became a political power in the 1920s, Stalinists have regularly resorted to slandering others as fascists. Social democracy was slandered as, quote, social fascism in the period of the late 20s to early 1930s, when Trotsky was slandered as a fascist agent. Later, students were shouting, quote, USA, SA, SS, end quote, while carrying pictures of Ho Chi Minh at demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Only a little bit later, some Maoists charged the Soviet Union with being fascistic, or social fascist. The closest Stalinism came to a, quote, fascism theory, end quote, was Georgy Dimitrov's idea that fascism was a particularly brutal form of capitalist domination to which the bourgeoisie in times of crisis would resort. Wikipedia says Georgy Dimitrov, also known as Georgy Mikhailovich Dimitrov, was a Bulgarian who lived from 1882 to 1949, was a Bulgarian communist politician who served as general secretary of the Bulgarian Communist Party from 1946 to 1949. From 1935 to 1943, Georgy Dimitrov Mikhailov was the general secretary of the Communist International. Born in Western Bulgaria, Georgy Dimitrov worked as a printer and trade unionist during his youth. Georgy Dimitrov was elected to the Bulgarian parliament as a socialist during the First World War and campaigned against the country's involvement, which led to his brief imprisonment for sedition. In 1919, Georgy Dimitrov helped found the Bulgarian Communist Party, and 2 years later, Georgy Dimitrov moved to the Soviet Union and was elected to the executive committee of the Profintern. In 1923, Georgy Dimitrov led a failed communist uprising against the government of Alexander Tsankov and was subsequently forced to exile. Georgy Dimitrov lived in the Soviet Union until 1929, when he relocated to Germany and became head of the Comintern operations in Central Europe. Dimitrov rose to international prominence in the aftermath of the Reichstag fire trial. Accused of plotting the arson, Georgy Dimitrov refused counsel and mounted an eloquent defense against his Nazi accusers, in particular Hermann Goering, ultimately winning acquittal. After the trial, Georgy Dimitrov relocated to Moscow and was elected head of Comintern. In 1946, Dimitrov returned to Bulgaria after 22 years in exile and was elected prime minister of the newly founded People's Republic of Bulgaria. Georgy Dimitrov negotiated with Josip Broz Tito to create a federation of Southern Slavs, which led to the 1947 Bled Accord. The plan ultimately fell apart over differences regarding the future of the joint country as well as the Macedonian question, and was completely abandoned following the fallout between Stalin and Tito. Georgy Dimitrov died after a short illness in 1949 in Barvika, near Moscow. Georgy Dimitrov's embalmed body was housed in the Georgy Dimitrov Mausoleum in Sofia until its removal in 1990. The mausoleum was demolished in 1999. So that's Georgy Dimitrov. Back to the text. The closest Stalinism came to a, quote, fascism theory, end quote, was Georgy Dimitrov's idea that fascism was just a particularly brutal form of capitalist domination to which the bourgeoisie in times of crisis would resort. Fascism was thus seen merely as a tool to smash the working class organizations. And since the Stalinists saw themselves as the very embodiment of the working class organization in the form of the, quote, Communist Party, end quote, the Stalinists could level the charge of fascism at anyone who was seen to be on the, quote, other side, end quote. Unfortunately, this bad habit was picked up by some leftists in the West. When, quote, applied, end quote, to Israel, it took on quite peculiar forms, such as Dieter Kunzelman demanding the left should get rid of its, quote, Jew complex, end quote, and Ulrike Meinhof's opinion that the massacre of the Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games in Munich was an anti-fascist action, showing that the developed imperialism was a, quote, through and through fascist system, end quote, i.e. even more fascist than, quote, NS fascism, end quote. See more below. Certainly one factor that caused some of the new left to turn against Israel in the summer and autumn of 1967 was the German press coverage, which described the Israeli military campaign in glowing positive terms as a blitzkrieg, and Moshe Dayan as a latter-day, quote, desert fox. So, I'm going to read two things. Desert Fox refers to Erwin Rommel. I'm going to read about Erwin Rommel, and then I'm going to read about Moshe Dayan. According to Wikipedia, Erwin Rommel, Johannes Erwin Eugen Rommel, who lived from 1891 to 1944, was a German General Field Marshal during World War II. Popularly known as the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel served in the Wehrmacht armed forces of Nazi Germany, as well as the Reichswehr of the Weimar Republic and the Army of Imperial Germany. Rommel was injured multiple times in both world wars. Rommel was a highly decorated officer in World War I and was awarded the Pour le Mérite for his actions on the Italian front. In 1937, Erwin Rommel published his classic book on military tactics, Infantry Attacks, drawing on his experiences in that war. In World War II, Erwin Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the 1940 invasion of France. Erwin Rommel's leadership of German and Italian forces in the North African campaign established Erwin Rommel's reputation as one of the ablest tank commanders of the war, and earning Erwin Rommel the nickname Der Wüstenfox, quote, the Desert Fox, end quote. Among Erwin Rommel's British adversaries, Erwin Rommel had a reputation for chivalry, and his phrase, quote, war without hate, end quote, has been uncritically used to describe the North African campaign. A number of historians have since rejected the phrase as a myth and uncovered numerous examples of German war crimes and abuses towards enemy soldiers and native populations in Africa during the conflict. Other historians note that there is no clear evidence Rommel was involved or aware of these crimes, with some pointing out that the war in the desert as fought by Rommel and Rommel's opponents still came as close to a clean fight as there was in World War II. Erwin Rommel later commanded the German forces opposing the Allied cross-channel invasion of Normandy in June 1944. After the Nazis gained power in Germany, Erwin Rommel gradually accepted the new regime. Historians have given different accounts of the specific period and his motivations. Erwin Rommel was a supporter of Adolf Hitler, at least until near the end of the war, if not necessarily sympathetic to the party and the paramilitary forces associated with it. In 1944, Erwin Rommel was implicated in the 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler. Because of Erwin Rommel's status as a national hero, Hitler wanted to eliminate Erwin Rommel quietly instead of having Erwin Rommel immediately executed, as many other plotters were. Erwin Rommel was given a choice between suicide in return for assurance that his reputation would remain intact and that his family would not be persecuted following his death, or facing a trial that would result in his disgrace and execution. Erwin Rommel chose the former and took a cyanide pill. Erwin Rommel was given a state funeral, and it was announced that Erwin Rommel had succumbed to his injuries from the strafing of his staff car in Normandy. Erwin Rommel became a larger-than-life figure in both Allied and Nazi Germany and in post-war popular culture. Numerous authors portray Erwin Rommel as an apolitical, brilliant commander and a victim of Nazi Germany, although other authors have contested this assessment and called it the, quote, Rommel myth. Erwin Rommel's reputation for conducting a clean war was used in the interest of the West German rearmament and reconciliation between the former enemies, the United Kingdom and the United States on the one side, and the new Federal Republic of Germany on the other. Several of Erwin Rommel's former subordinates, notably his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, played key roles in German rearmament and integration into NATO in the post-war era. The German army's largest military base, the Field Marshal Rommel Barracks, Augustdorf, and a third ship of Lutyens-class destroyer of the German Navy are both named in Rommel's honor. Erwin Rommel's son, Manfred Rommel, was the longtime mayor of Stuttgart, Germany, and the namesake of Stuttgart Airport. Jesus. So that's Erwin Rommel. Now we're going to Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan, who lived from 1915 to 1981, was an Israeli military leader and politician. As commander of the Jerusalem Front in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, 1953 to 1958, and during the 1956 Suez Crisis, and especially as defense minister during the Six-Day War in 1967, Moshe Dayan became a worldwide fighting symbol of the new state of Israel. In the 1930s, Dayan joined the Haganah, the pre-state Jewish defense force of Mandatory Palestine. Dayan served in the Special Night Squads under Orda Wingate during the Arab Revolt in Palestine, and later lost an eye to a sniper in a raid on Vichy forces in Lebanon during World War II. Dayan was close to David Ben-Gurion and joined David Ben-Gurion in leaving the Mapai Party and setting up the Rafi Party in 1965 with Shimon Peres. Dayan became defense minister just before the 1967 Six-Day War. After the Yom Kippur War of 1973, during which Dayan served as defense minister, Dayan was blamed for the lack of preparedness. After some time, Dayan resigned. In 1955, Dayan, following the election of Menahem Begin as prime minister, Dayan was expelled from the Israeli Labor Party because he joined the Likud-led government as foreign minister, playing an important part in negotiating the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. So back to the text. Those were some long lookups. So I'm going to reread this last sentence. Certainly one factor that caused some of the New Left to turn against Israel in the summer and autumn of 1967 was the German press coverage, which described the Israeli military campaign in glowingly positive terms as a blitzkrieg, and Moshe Dayan as a latter-day, quote, desert fox. Okay, so what I'm guessing is that this kind of like Rommel myth was in that I just mentioned, was alive in the German press at this time, right? That seems like what is being said here. Yeah. So that's very interesting. I learned a whole bunch of shit real quick. Certainly one factor that caused some of the New Left to turn against Israel in the summer and autumn of 1967 was the German press coverage, which described the Israeli military campaign in glowingly positive terms as a blitzkrieg, and Moshe Dayan as a latter-day, quote, desert fox, end quote. Nevertheless, this doesn't explain the historically wrong and absurd justifications prevalent in the left. It seems rather the case that Kunzelman's anti-Semitism, for example, was, quote, unlocked, end quote, and his organization tried to bomb a Jewish community center in West Berlin on the very anniversary of the day the Nazis unleashed their violent public attack on Jews in 1938, the, quote, Kristallnacht. Let's see. Going back to the Wikipedia on Tupamaros, West Berlin, there's a section called the Jewish Community Center Bombing Attempt. Historian Wolfgang Kauschar's 2005 book on the Tupamaros attempted bombing of the West Berlin Jewish Community Center set off a debate on anti-Semitism in the German student movement. The bombing was allegedly planned by Kunzelmann and the bomb itself planted by Albert Fichter, brother of the Sozialistische Deutscher Studentenbund's then chairman, Tilman Fichter. On the date of the attempted bombing, more than 200 people had gathered in the community center to commemorate Kristallnacht. Back to the text. Neues Deutschland. What's that? Wikipedia says, Neues Deutschland is a left-wing German daily newspaper headquartered in Berlin. For 43 years, Neues Deutschland was the official party newspaper of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, the SED, which governed East Germany, officially known as the German Democratic Republic, and as such served as one of the party's most important organs. The Neues Deutschland that existed in East Germany had a circulation of 1.1 million as of 1989 and was the Communist Party's main way to show citizens its stances and opinions about politics, economics, etc. It was regarded by foreign countries as the communist regime's diplomatic voice. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Neues Deutschland has lost 99% of its readership and has a circulation of 16,028 as of 2022. Between 2019 and 2020, the number of sold copies and subscriptions declined 14.8%. Since 1990, the newspaper has changed its political outlook and now has a democratic socialist political stance. The newspaper was both politically and financially tied to one of its former owners, the left, Die Linke, which owned the publishing house and printing press until the end of 2021. Since 2022, the newspaper is published by a cooperative of staff and subscribers and officially named ND. So that's Neues Deutschland. Neues Deutschland, in the meantime, inevitably reported the wars and conflicts in the Middle East as a conflict of an imperialist Israel as the only aggressor, all the while keeping quiet about the aggressive activities of the other side. In the official language of the GDR media and politicians glossed over the terrorist activity of the GDR's Palestinian allies, then this may have been tactical. Herf writes, quote, "When speaking frankly to one another, however, Stasi officers used refreshing candor, acknowledging the nature of terrorism and their willingness to support it," end quote. In other publications in the GDR, the issue was handled slightly differently. For example, in Terror Hintergründe, Täter Opfer by Martin Roba, the title means Terror, Backgrounds, Perpetrators, and Victims. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is clearly described as a terrorist organization, although some excuses are made. Let's see if anything comes up from Martin Roba. Martin Roba, who lived from 1932 to 2013, was a German historian and Orientalist specializing in developing countries, especially the Middle East. That's all it says. That's from the Wikipedia. German Wikipedia. Back to the text. In other publications of the GDR, the issue is handled slightly differently. For example, in Terror, Hintergründe, Täter, Opfer by Martin Roba, the title means Terror, Backgrounds, Perpetrators, Victims. The PFLP is clearly described as a terrorist organization, although some excuses are made. The main thrust of the booklet is still the dominant anti-Zionism. Crucially, George Habash. Let's go back to George Habash. Wikipedia says George Habash, also known by his Laqab al-Hakim, the wise man or the doctor, lived from 1926 to 2008, was a Palestinian politician and physician who founded the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. George Habash was born in Lydda, Lydda, Mandatory Palestine, in 1926. In 1948, 19-year-old Habash, a medical student at the American University of Beirut, went to his hometown of Lydda during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, when the people of the city and his family were driven out in what became known as the Lydda Death March that led to the death of his sister. In 1951, after graduating first in his class from medical school, George Habash worked in Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan and ran a clinic in Amman. George Habash later relocated to Syria and Lebanon. In 1967, after being sidelined in the Palestinian Liberation Organization by Yasser Arafat, George Habash founded the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a leftist movement which opposes the existence of Israel and advocates for a single democratic secular state in the entire region. In the 1970 Dawson's field hijackings, George Habash masterminded the hijackings of 4 Western airliners in Jordan, which led to the Black September conflict and George Habash's subsequent exile in Lebanon. George Habash remained opposed to a two-state solution even after the PLO signed the Oslo Peace Accords in 1993. George Habash resigned as a Secretary General of the PFLP due to ill health in 2000 and died of a heart attack in 2008. Back to the text. Crucially, George Habash, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is quoted as saying, quote, "The attacks of the People's Front are based on quality, not quantity. We believe to kill a Jew away from the battlefield is more efficient than to kill 100 of them in battle. It draws more attention. And if we set fire to a department store in London, these few flames are worth more than if we burn down 2 kibbutzim." End quote. George Habash. The remarkable thing is that George Habash is clearly speaking about Jews and not, quote, Zionists, end quote, and declares them to be worldwide targets. George Habash makes no effort to conceal the clearly anti-Semitic nature of the campaigns of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, nor does the GDR journalist Martin Roba see a need to camouflage it. Nevertheless, the GDR needed to balance its support for the, quote, anti-imperialist struggle, end quote, with a certain respectability, meaning to avoid being seen as a state sponsor of terrorism. Jeffrey Herf calls this a, quote, Eurocentric, end quote, approach, which meant at once supporting the activities in the Middle East, but not allowing its territory to be a springboard for terrorist activities in Western Europe. See, so that's what I was talking about earlier, if you remember, when I was saying that I think even Jeffrey Herf says that like when I was reading through the Wikipedia about the RAF and the other left-wing armed struggle groups in the 1960s and 70s, was saying that it said that the Stasi or the GDR was funding these groups, and it said questionable, discuss, like it was that the citation was inconclusive or whatever. What that was saying, what I was saying there was that, yeah, I think even Jeffrey Herf says that the East Germany did not promote terrorism in the soil in Europe, or at least in here it's saying Europe, but I think at the very least in the Federal Republic of Germany. So yeah, that's kind of being said here, right? The GDR needed to balance its support for the, quote, anti-imperialist struggle, end quote, with retaining a certain respectability, meaning to avoid being seen as a state sponsor of terrorism. Herf calls this a, quote, Eurocentric, end quote, approach. It meant at once supporting the activities in the Middle East, but not allowing its territory to be a springboard for terrorist activities in Western Europe. Section 2. Herf is using some examples of the radical left in its support for Palestinian terrorism. Here, Herf is very selective with the information he provides and leaves out substantial context. I will illustrate this with 3 examples. 1. Ulrike Meinhof. In the July 1967 issue of a monthly left-wing news magazine, Konkret, Ulrike Meinhof's editorial was titled 3 Friends of Israel. Drei Freunde Israelis. I guess that's how you say it. Only weeks after the Six-Day War, Meinhof expressed the solidarity of the left with Israel, a solidarity Meinhof described as unconditional, but something Meinhof managed to express in a critical way, pointing out, quote, justified demands, end quote, of the Arab side. Meinhof juxtaposes this solidarity with the other 2 Friends of Israel, besides the left, U.S. imperialism and the German right-wing press. Both of these are shown to simply instrumentalize a supposed friendship with Israel for their own particular purposes. Both are shown to be hypocritical compared to a left solidarity based on anti-fascism. As far as I know, Meinhof did not return to this topic in her time as Konkret's star columnist. Increasingly, Konkret's coverage reflected the, quote, anti-Zionist turn, end quote, of the rest of the left in those years. Meinhof, in the meantime, was drifting away, but for different reasons. Meinhof and her husband, Konkret publisher Klaus Rainer Ruhl, developed all kinds of differences, political and concerning the direction of the magazine, personal, political, and in the direction, personal, political, and concerning the direction of the magazine. Wikipedia says Klaus Rainer Ruhl, who lived from 1928 to 2021, was a German journalist and author, best known as founder, owner, publisher, and editor-in-chief of Konkret, the most influential magazine on the German political left from the 1960s to the early 1970s. Klaus Rainer Ruhl later became critical of communism and leftist tendencies. Back to the text. Meinhof radicalized her position to the point of picking up arms against the state and became one of the founders of the Red Army faction. This is not the place to reiterate the history of this most important of the urban guerrilla groups, but to mention the text she wrote following the kidnapping and subsequent killing of 11 Israeli Olympic athletes at the Munich Olympic Games in 1972. So I just want to read the Wikipedia real quick for the Munich Massacre. The Munich Massacre was a terrorist attack carried out during the 1972 Summer Olympic Games in Munich, West Germany, by 8 members of the Palestinian militant organization Black September, who infiltrated the Olympic Village, killed 2 members of the Israeli Olympic team, and took 9 others hostage. Black September called the operation, quote, Iqud and Biram, end quote, after 2 Palestinian Christian villages whose inhabitants were expelled by the Israeli Defense Forces during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Black September commander was Lutif Afif, who was also their negotiator. West German neo-Nazis gave the group logistical assistance. Shortly after the hostages were taken, Afif demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners who were being held in Israeli jails. But the West German imprisoned founders of the Red Army faction, Andreas Baader, plus the West German imprisoned founders of the Red Army faction, Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof. West German police ambushed the terrorists and killed 5 of the 8 Black September members, but the rescue attempt failed and all the hostages were killed. A West German policeman was also killed in the crossfire, and the West German government was criticized for the poor execution of its rescue attempt and its overall handling of the incident. The 3 surviving perpetrators were Adnan al-Ghashi, Jamal al-Ghashi, and Mohammed Safadi, who were arrested only to be released the next month in the hostage exchange which followed the hijacking of the Lufthansa Flight 615. By then, the Israeli government had launched an assassination campaign which authorized Mossad to track down and kill anyone who played a role in the attack. 2 days prior to the start of the 2016 Summer Olympics, in a ceremony led by Brazilian and Israeli officials, the International Olympic Committee honored the 11 Israelis and 1 German who were killed at Munich. In the 2020 Summer Olympics, a moment of silence was observed in the opening. Back to the text. In Meinhof's The Action of Black September in Munich on the Strategy of Anti-Imperialist Struggle, Die Action des Schwarzen September in München, zur Strategie des anti-imperialistischen Kampfes, Meinhof celebrates the massacre as, quote, simultaneously anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, and internationalist, end quote. Herf calls this text, quote, one of the most important documents in the history of anti-Semitism in Europe after the Holocaust, end quote. In any case, there is nothing, quote, anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, and internationalist, end quote, about kidnapping and murdering Israeli athletes. The whole text is a mind-boggling read, much less stringent and articulate than das Konzept statt Guerilla, the first programmatic text of the RAF from April 1971, and an eternity away from the nuanced concrete column just 5 years earlier. Herf, however, presents Meinhof's position as static rather than the end point of a shocking development. Herf does the same when Herf describes the coverage of the Israeli-Palestine conflict in the paper Arbeiterkampf, where the development went in the opposite direction. I can't find anything for Arbeiterkampf. But new section, Arbeiterkampf. Under the subchapter titled, The West German Radical Left Responds to the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Terrorism, Herf focuses on 2 communist organizations, the Kommunistischer Bund Westdeutschland Sorry, 1 second. Copy, pin. according to German Wikipedia, the communist, that organization is translated as the Communist League of West Germany, which is a Maoist West German cave group that existed from 1973 until early 1985. The Communist League of West Germany emerged mainly from the Mannheim-Heidelberg communist group New Red Forum, named KGNRF, a successor organization to the Heidelberg SDS founded in the fall of 1970, and the Bremen Communist League, as well as other circle, quote, bunds, end quote. In 1982, the Communist League of West Germany largely stopped its political work and dissolved in 1985 after lengthy negotiations about the realization of its millions in assets. Some of its members later became active in leading positions in federal and state politics, including Reinhard Bütikofer, Winfried Kretschmann, Ursula Lutzer, Christa Zager, Ralph Fuchs, and Ulla Schmidt. It's Ralph Fuchs. I feel like I looked him up recently. Yeah, Ralph Fuchs is like a, I don't know, I think he's in the Green Party. It says he's in the Green Party, but I think he's written a lot of shit on anti-Semitism. The other group that was just mentioned is Kommunistischer Bund. And Wikipedia says this group, which can translate as the Communist League, was a relatively strong political organization compared to other groups organized in the radical left spectrum. Initially with a Maoist orientation and later belonging to the undogmatic left, the Communist League was counted among the kid groups and existed until 1991. So back to the text. Herf focuses on two communist organizations in Germany, the Kommunistische Bund Westdeutschland and the Kommunistische Bund, in its paper Arbeiterkampf. Both organizations are commonly seen as so-called K groups, Marxist-Leninist groups which formed in the period of decline of the radical student movement after 1968, following a, quote, anti-revisionist, end quote, line, meaning they opposed the Soviet Union and supported Maoist China. While the Kommunistische Bund Westdeutschland stayed firmly Maoist until its end in the early to mid-80s, the Kommunistische Bund was a more independently minded organization and moved from a broadly Maoist outset to a more undogmatic position. I want to read some of the members from the Kommunistische Bund. That's on the Wikipedia as well. I think a lot of these people become like something at least related to the anti-Deutsch. I'm not sure. But Angelika Baer, 2002 to 2004, federal chairwoman of the Alliance/Greens, member of the Pirate Party of Germany, November 2009. Thomas Ebermann, a leading representative of the eco-socialist wing of the Greens in the 1980s, journalist and cabaret artist. I think he's like a affiliated with anti-Deutsch. I'm not sure. I think he might still write, but I'm not sure. Kai Ehlers, journalist, Russia expert, transformation researcher. Jürgen Lesser, journalist, cross-front activist. Jan Feddersen, journalist, Taz, gay activist and Eurovision Song Contest and hit expert. Claudia Goda, 1991 to 1997 on the PDS Federal Executive Board, currently head of the left's De Linke's federal office. Andre Gysi, Nea Lederer, lawyer and member of the Bundestag for PDS from 1990 to 1998, married to Gregor Gysi from 1996 to 2013. Bettina Hutle, Hulya, I don't know, Hultia, might be the Hultia, I think is probably how you say it. 1981 to 1980 to 1981 on the Federal Executive Board of the Green Party. 1982 and 1985 to 1986, Hamburg representative of the GAL, feminist psychologist and author. Ulla Jelpka, 1905 to 1990 to 2002 and 2005 to 2021, member of the Bundestag for the PDS and Die Linke, domestic policy spokeswoman for the Bundestag faction, ex-editor of the daily newspaper Junge Welt, for which she continues to work as an author. Matthias Kunzel, journalist. Matthias Kunzel has talks with Jeffrey Herf. Knut Mellenthin, journalist. Jürgen Rentz, politician, journalist, editor-in-chief of the daily newspaper Neues Deutschland from 1999 to 2012. Bernard Schmidt, journalist, author, lawyer at a French anti-racism NGO. Micha Stein, musician, cabaret artist, and author. Hans-Georg Stumke, writer, teacher, historian, and journalist. Rainer Trampert, 1982 to 1987, Federal Executive Committee spokesman for the Green Party, leading representative of the eco-socialist wing of the Green Party, until his resignation in 1990, journalist and cabaret artist. Jürgen Tritten, 1994 to 1998, Federal spokesman of Alliance 90/Greens, 1998 to 2005, Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety, 2009 to 2013, Chairman of the Bundestag Parliamentary Group of Alliance 90/the Greens, and Justus Wertmüller, author, thought leader from the Bahamas magazine, Bahamas being affiliated with the Anti-Deutsch. So, where am I? Back to the text. Let me, where am I? Well, the Kommunistische Bund Westdeutschland stayed firmly Maoist until its end in the early to mid-80s. The Kommunistische Bund was a more independently minded organization and moved from a broadly Maoist outset to a more undogmatic position. There's a footnote here, and the footnote says, the Kommunistische Bund should be translated as Communist League. Herf instead gives it two names and two different sets of numbers of members and circulation of the paper within the space of 2 pages. Once he calls it Communist Organization and once Communist Association. Membership is given as 1,700 strong and as 800 to 1,500 a page later. Circulation of Arbeiterkampf at 24,000 and 17,000 respectively. This is an example of shoddy copy editing on the side of author and publishing house, and not the only one. End footnote. The problem here is that the author doesn't take into account the development of the KB. This is still Fringeli. The problem here is that the author doesn't take into account the development of the KB organization. Even in the context of the Munich massacre of 1972, there were differing opinions expressed in Arbeiterkampf, one of which Herf quotes, creating the impression that this was the organization's sole opinion. Granted, even the differing opinions were at this point firmly rooted in an anti-Zionist consensus and only differed minimally. If we look at Arbeiterkampf's coverage of the Yom Kippur War, it is striking how Israel is constantly portrayed as the only aggressor. The coverage is one-sided, often manipulative, and frankly dishonest. Much is made of Israel-friendly press coverage by the Springer papers as if that proved already that surely Israel was wrong, evil, and its enemies should be supported. Meinhof's crucial insight into this matter from 1967 had been well and truly forgotten in the radical left of 1973. Sacrifice for an uncritical anti-imperialism. This is certainly the case for most of the K groups. However, an article in issue 37, December 1973 of Arbeiterkampf, titled, quote, "The Arab Bourgeoisie with the People Against the People," end quote, mainly focusing on Egypt, is interesting in that it shows this anti-imperialism not being devoid of criticism. It describes a society between the demagoguery of, quote, Arab socialism, end quote, of the ruling party and the, quote, Islamic fascist, end quote, Muslim Brotherhood. It also denounces not only the opportunistic foreign policies of the Egyptian government, but also its, quote, fascist domestic policies, end quote, even pointing out that under the post-1967 war economy, the people were burdened with economic hardships while the war against Israel was used to deflect the class struggle. Over the years, other cracks in the consensus started showing in Arbeiterkampf, albeit slowly. In July 1981, an article was published under the title Hoffmann bei, quote, den Palästinensern Stern, end quote. Anmerkungen zu Neonazis und ihren arabischen Freunden, or Hoffmann with the Palestinians, Notes on Neo-Nazis and their Arab Friends. Here the author's reactor reports in the press that the neo-Nazi paramilitaries of the Versportsgruppe Hoffmann, the Hoffmann paramilitary group, had contacts with the PLO/AI Fatah that included arms deals and training in Palestinian camps. Sorry, 1 second. I'm trying to look up this Hoffmann group. Okay, so this is from the German Wikipedia. The Versportsgruppe Hoffmann was a right-wing extremist organization that existed from 1973 to 1982. It was founded by the neo-Nazi Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, and with around 400 to 600 members, developed into the largest and best-known military sports club in the Federal Republic of Germany. In 1980, the Hoffmann Military Sports Group was banned as an anti-constitutional organization by Federal Interior Minister Gerhard Baum, and then moved by Hoffmann to a PLO camp in Lebanon. This WSG abroad existed until 1982, but fell apart after Hoffmann's arrest in June 1981. The Hoffmann Military Sports Group is considered the nucleus or transit station of German right-wing terrorism. The former WSG member Gundolf Köhler carried out the Oktoberfest attack in Munich on the 26th of September 1980, the worst terrorist attack in German history to date. The WSG deputy head, Uwe Behrendt, murdered Rabbi Shlomo Levin and his partner, Frieda Puschka, in Erlangen on December 19, 1980. In February 1981, the Hoffmann Military Sports Group member K. Uwe Bergmann died as a result of torture that Hoffmann had ordered and carried out with Uwe Behrendt. Bergmann's death was never fully explained. Frank Schubert was part of the WSG environment in Frankfurt am Main around 1979 before he shot 2 Swiss border guards and then himself during an attempted arms smuggling in 1980. After his terrorist training in the Hoffmann Military Sports Group abroad, Ottfried Hepp co-founded the Hepp-Kexel Group, which carried out several terrorist attacks from 1982 onwards. The neo-Nazi Helmut Ochsner, who shot 3 people in Nuremberg for racist reasons in 1982, was also a supporter of the Hoffmann Military Sports Group. So that's who that is. I'm going to repeat the sentence that it was in. Back to the text. Over the years, other cracks in the consensus started showing in Arbeiterkampf, albeit slowly. In July 1981, an article was published under the title Hoffman with the Palestinians, Notes on Neo-Nazis and Their Arab Friends. Here the authors react to reports in the press that the neo-Nazi paramilitaries of the Hoffman Military Sports Group had contacts with the PLO/AI Fatah that included arms deals and training in Palestinian camps. Although the authors partially try to dismiss these reports, they made their own investigation of the, quote, brown trail of relations between West German fascists and Arab right-wing extremists, end quote, which was, quote, clearly possible to follow and is beyond doubt, end quote. The article traces the exodus of Nazis from Germany to Egypt in 1945 and the opportunities they had there to continue their anti-Semitic agitation. Quote, the central figure was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and symbolic leader of, quote, all Palestinians, end quote, Haj Amin al-Husseini, then based in Cairo. Before 1945, Haj Amin al-Husseini was active as a Nazi propagandist, first in Berlin and then in France. Sorry, that was a quote from Herf. The central figure was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and symbolic leader of, quote, all Palestinians, end quote, Haj Amin al-Husseini, then based in Cairo. Before 1945, Amin al-Husseini was active as a Nazi propagandist, first in Berlin, then in France, end quote. Nazis in Egypt had a field day after the coup d'etat of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Quote, under Nasser, former Nazi Wehrmacht officers, SS men, and Gestapo cadres were moving in droves into the teams of experts of the Egyptian police, army, and propaganda apparatus. End quote. Herf. The article... Oh, no, this isn't... No, those quotes aren't from Herf. This is from the Arbeiterkampf article. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm fucking up. The article also mentions the promotion of Hitler's Mein Kampf as well as the denial of the Holocaust in this remarkable quote from Egyptian Foreign Minister Hussein Zulfikar Sabri. I gotta look this person up, sorry. There's not really anything for him. So I'm not really finding anything. The article also mentions the promotion of Hitler's Mein... This is back to Fringeli. The article also mentions the promotion of Hitler's Mein Kampf as well as the denial of the Holocaust in this remarkable quote from the Egyptian Foreign Minister Hussein Zulfikar Sabri, who lived from 1915 to 1994, from a speech in the Egyptian parliament, quote, the Nazis never exterminated 6 million Jews, not even 1 million. Hitler allowed Jews to emigrate if they paid a certain sum. As far as the poorer Jews were concerned, he sent them into camps so he could negotiate with the Zionist leaders in order to get the finance and materials he needed for the continuation of the war, end quote. The, quote, first activists, end quote, of the post-war Nazi scene, quote, knew, therefore, exactly who they had to approach for their efforts at, quote, German-Arab friendship, end quote, when former Goebbels co-worker Egon Arthur Schmidt organized a first meeting to found a German-Arab League. Sorry, there's not much for him. When former Goebbels co-worker Egon Arthur Schmidt organized a first meeting to found a, quote, German Arab League, end quote, representatives of the Arab League as well as the consulates of Egypt and Syria were present. The Wikipedia for Arab League says, the Arab League, formerly the League of Arab States, is a regional organization in the Arab world. The Arab League was formed in Cairo on the 22nd of March 1945, initially with 6 members: Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Yemen joined as a member on the 5th of May 1945. Currently, the League has 22 members. The League's main goal is to, quote, draw closer the relations between member states and coordinate collaboration between them to safeguard their independence and sovereignty, and to consider in a general way the affairs and interests of the Arab countries, end quote. The organization has received a relatively low level of cooperation throughout its history. Through institutions, notably the Arab League Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization and the Economic and Social Council of its Council of Arab Economic Unity, the League facilitates political, economic, cultural, scientific, and social programs designed to promote the interests of the Arab world. It has served as a forum for the member states to coordinate policy, arrange studies of and committees as to matters of common concern, settle interstate disputes, and limit conflicts such as the 1958 Lebanon crisis. The League has served as the platform for the drafting and conclusion of many landmark documents promoting economic integration. One example is the Joint Arab Economic Action Charter, which outlines the principles for economic activities in the region. Each member state has 1 vote in the Council of the Arab League, and decisions are binding only for those states that have voted for them. The aims of the League in 1945 are to strengthen and coordinate the political, cultural, economic, and social programs of its members, and to mediate disputes among them or between them and third parties. Furthermore, the signing of an agreement on joint defense and economic cooperation on the 13th of April 1950 committed the signatories to coordination of military defense measures. In March 2015, the Arab League General Secretary announced the establishment of a joint Arab force with the aim of counteracting extremism and other threats to the Arab states. The decision was reached while Operation Decisive Storm was intensifying in Yemen. Participation in the project is voluntary, and the Army intervenes only at the request of one of the member states. Heightened military arsenal in many member states and in a small minority civil wars as well as terrorist movements were the impetuses for JAF's establishment. In the early 1970s, the Economic Council put forward a proposal to create the Joint Arab Chambers of Commerce across international states. That led to the setting up of mandates to promote, encourage, and facilitate bilateral trade between the Arab world and significant trading partners. So let me read the sentence that I stopped in order to look that up. Look up the Arab League. The first activists of the post-war Nazi scene, quote, knew therefore exactly who they had to approach for their efforts at, quote, German-Arab friendship, end quote. And when former Goebbels co-worker Egon Arthur Schmidt organized a first meeting to found a, quote, German-Arab League, end quote, representatives of the Arab League as well as the consulates of Egypt and Syria were present. Several such attempts at forming collaborative organizations followed by different sections of the German far right, both from ex-Nazis as well as from the Otto Strasser movement. Wikipedia says, on Strasserism. Strasserism is an ideological strand of Nazism that adheres to revolutionary nationalism and economic anti-Semitism, which conditions are to be achieved with radical mass action and worker-based politics that are more aggressive than the politics of the Hitlerite leaders of the Nazi Party. Named after Gregor Strasser and Otto Strasser, the ideology of Strasserism is a type of third position, right-wing politics in opposition to communism and to Hitlerite Nazism. In his political career, Otto Strasser led an ultra-nationalist faction within the Nazi Party but resigned from the party in 1930. He later established the Combat League of Revolutionary National Socialism, the Black Front, to rival the Nazi Party. Consequent to his politics, Otto Strasser fled Germany in 1933 and returned at the war's end in 1945. In the intramural politics of the Nazi Party, Strasserism had many supporters among the troops of the Sturmabteilung SA, which led to Hitler's purging the Strasserist faction and killing their leader, Gregor Strasser, on the Night of the Long Knives in July 1934. In the 1980s, the revolutionary nationalism and economic anti-Semitism of Strasserism appeared in the politics of the National Front Party in the UK. One second. Okay. Several such attempts at forming collaborative organizations, followed by different sections of the German far right, both from ex-Nazis as well as from the Otto Strasser movement. Their Deutsch-Arabische Gesellschaft, German Arab Society, was, according to Arbeiterkampf, quote, excellent at anti-Israel propaganda, as well as propaganda directed against the Wiedergutmachungsleistungen, restitutions towards Israel, end quote. Irvin Schönborn, look him up. Irvin Schönborn, who lived from 1914 to 1989, was a German publisher who became known as a neo-Nazi historical revisionist and Holocaust denier. Irvin Schönborn, an organizer, Irvin Schönborn, an organizer, publisher, and Holocaust denier with a decade-long history, was the connection from the post-war days to the later neo-Nazi movement. In the final paragraphs the Arbeiterkampf authors point out that the, quote, assassins of Black September at the Munich Olympics 1972 chose, quote, a lawyer explicitly from the far-right scene, R.A. attorney Schüttler from Recklinghausen, who otherwise is mainly known for his legal action on behalf of Croatian terrorists associated with the Ustasha, end quote. The article then pointed out that prominent Nazi terrorists found refuge in the Middle East and Iran, among them Manfred Roeder and the aforementioned Hoffmann. Let's see if there's anything for Manfred Roeder. Manfred Roeder, who lived from 1929 to 2014, was a German lawyer and neo-Nazi terrorist. Roeder was a Holocaust denier and an early representative of the Reichsbürger movement. So that's who Manfred Roeder is. The article ends, quote, back to the text. The article ends, quote, instead of conducting the unthankful business of fabricating out of this a renewed, quote, proof, end quote, of the connection between, quote, right and left terror, end quote, it would be necessary to completely uncover this thread of international brown contacts. At least the federal German VS, Internal Security Service, doesn't seem to be in a mood for this, end quote. Well, the German left wasn't very much in the mood for it either. Arbeiterkampf also joined the anti-Zionist chorus again a year later. The 1982 Lebanon War broke out in the paper titled Final Solution of the Palestinian Question. By then, this wasn't the consensus anymore. It was rejected by Central Committee member Eva Grupler and others. Where am I? Let's see if there's anything for Eva Grupler. Didn't see anything for her. It seems like there's some German books, but there's no like bio that's really popping out. Let me type in Wikipedia, see if anything. No. Grupler published a series of articles in Arbeiterkampf dealing with the history of anti-Semitism, but ended up leaving. What do you mean? Oh, like in the neighborhood? Yeah, in a minute, yeah. I don't know, probably not. If you're walking. I'm reading this thing. I'll finish up in a second. Grupler published a series of articles in Arbeiterkampf dealing with the history of anti-Semitism, but ended up leaving the KB in 1986. From 1989 onwards, though, there were some radical changes, and a faction of the KB started developing a more systematic and explicit critique of anti-Zionism. When the KB finally split and dissolved itself in 1991, one faction initially called itself Gruppe K and published the journal Bahamas, which still appears today, moved towards a position of unconditional solidarity with Israel. And even the other half, which went on to publish Arbeiterkampf after renaming it Analyse und Kritik, which also still appears today, abandoned the uncritical anti-Zionism of yesteryear. Three, revolutionary cells from Entebbe to, quote, Gerd Albertus is dead, end quote. Or Gerd Albertus? Gerd Albertus, known as Gerd Albertus, was a German terrorist of the revolutionary cells. He was murdered by Palestinian terrorists. The most infamous case of German left anti-Semitism of the 1970s is probably the involvement of two members of the revolutionary cells in the hijacking of an Air France plane on its way from Tel Aviv to Paris. The hijacking was done by a spin-off of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine external operations under the orders of Wadi Haddad. Not to look up there. So, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine external operations were organizational names used by Palestinian radical Wadi Haddad when engaging in international attacks which were not sanctioned by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And Wadi Haddad, who lived from 1927 to 1978, also known as Abu Hani, was a Palestinian militant who led the combat operations of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Wadi Haddad was responsible for organizing several hijackings of international civilian passenger aircraft in the 1960s and 1970s, the most infamous of which was the Entebbe hijacking when Palestinian/German militants under his command held 106 hostages, both Israeli and non-Israeli Jews, on a flight from Israel to France after diverting to Uganda. So, let me repeat this back to the text. The hijacking was done by a spin-off of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine External Operations, under the orders of Wadi Haddad. The plane eventually landed in Entebbe, Uganda, where the hijackers enjoyed the protection of dictator Idi Amin, a vicious anti-Semite and admirer of Hitler. So Idi Amin, who lived from 1928 to 2003, was a Ugandan military officer and politician who served as the third president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979. Idi Amin ruled as a military dictator and is considered one of the most brutal despots in modern world history. Idi Amin was born in Kakwa to a Kakwa father and Lugbara mother. In 1946, Idi Amin joined the King's African Rifles, KAR, of the British colonial army as a cook. Idi Amin rose to the rank of lieutenant, taking part in British actions against Somali rebels and then the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. Uganda gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1962. Idi Amin remained in the army, rising to the position of major and being appointed commander of the Ugandan army in 1965. Idi Amin became aware of the Ugandan president Milton Obote. Became aware that Ugandan President Milton Obote was planning to arrest Idi Amin for misappropriating army funds. So Idi Amin launched the 1971 Uganda coup d'etat and declared himself president. During his years in power, Idi Amin shifted from being a pro-Western ruler enjoying considerable support from Israel to being backed by Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, Zaïre's Mobutu. Mobutu Sese Seko, the Soviet Union, and East Germany. In 1972, Idi Amin expelled Asians, a majority of whom were Indian Ugandans, leading India to sever diplomatic relations with Idi Amin's regime. In 1975, Idi Amin became the chairman of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, a pan-Africanist group designed to promote solidarity among African states. Uganda was a member of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights from 1977 to 1979. The United Kingdom broke diplomatic relations with Uganda in 1977, and Idi Amin declared that he had defeated the British and added, quote, CBE, end quote, to his title for, quote, conqueror of the British Empire, end quote. As Idi Amin's rule progressed into the late 1970s, there was increased unrest against his persecution of certain ethnic groups and political dissidents, along with Uganda's very poor international standing due to Amin's support for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine External Operations and RZ hijackers in 1976. Revolutionary Cells hijackers in 1976, leading to Israel's Operation Entebbe. Idi Amin then attempted to annex Tanzania's Kagera region in 1978. The Tanzanian president Julius Nyerere, never remember how to pronounce that guy's name, ordered his troops to invade Uganda in response. Tanzanian army and rebel forces successfully captured Kampala in 1979 and ousted Idi Amin from power. Idi Amin went into exile first to Libya, then Iraq, and finally in Saudi Arabia, where Idi Amin lived until his death in 2003. Idi Amin's rule was characterized by rampant human rights abuses, including political repression, ethnic persecution, extrajudicial killings, as well as nepotism, corruption, and gross economic mismanagement. International observers and human rights groups estimate that between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed under Idi Amin's regime. So that's Idi Amin. Back to the text, so I'm going to repeat that. The plane eventually landed in Entebbe, Uganda, where the hijackers enjoyed the protection of dictator Idi Amin, a vicious anti-Semite and admirer of Hitler. As the story goes, the passengers were divided into two groups, Jewish and non-Jewish. The non-Jewish half was freed, the other kept as hostages. If this is true, then this was the first time since the Holocaust the Germans were involved in selecting Jews for possible murder. Testimony from Jewish survivors is that they felt a mass execution was imminent. Footnote. Come on. A recent book titled Legenden Entebbe, edited by Marcus Moore, tries to show that the quote, selection narrative, end quote, is, quote, nonsense, end quote. While Moore and his co-authors amassed an impressive amount of material and provided an interesting read, they failed in the stated aim. Even if there were no strict separation between Jewish and non-Jewish passengers, but, quote, only, end quote, one based on whether they had Israeli passports, there was clearly a specific selection. The use of the term is justified even if a handful of Jewish passengers were freed for whatever reasons. After all, the selections in the extermination camp were not separating Jews from non-Jews, but those Jews who were about to be murdered immediately from those that were still of some, quote, use, end quote, in the work camp. While it is worthwhile to scrutinize these, quote, narratives, end quote, one should remember that history does not merely consist of narratives. End footnote. This did not happen. Instead, an Israeli commando flew to Uganda and managed to free most of the hostages. These hostages, the Israeli commander, Jonathan Netanyahu, brother of the current prime minister, all the hijackers and several dozen Ugandan soldiers were killed. Jonathan Netanyahu, who lived from 1946 to 1976, was an Israeli military officer who commanded Sayeret Matkal during the Entebbe raid. The raid was launched in response to the 1976 hijacking of an international civilian passenger flight from Israel to France by Palestinian and German militants, who took control of the aircraft during a stopover in Greece and diverted it to Libya and then to Uganda, where they received support from the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. Though Israel's counter-terrorist operation was a success, 102 of the 106 hostages being rescued, Netanyahu was killed in action, the only Israeli soldier killed during the crisis. The eldest son of the Israeli professor, Benzion Netanyahu, Yonatan was born in New York City and spent much of his youth in the United States, where he attended high school. After serving in the Israeli army during the Six-Day War, Yoni Netanyahu briefly attended Harvard University before transferring to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1968. Thereafter, Yonatan Netanyahu left his studies and returned to military service in Israel. Yonatan Netanyahu joined Sayeret Matkal in the early 1970s and was awarded the Medal of Distinguished Service for his conduct in the Yom Kippur War. After his death, Operation Entebbe was renamed Operation Yonatan in his honor. Benjamin Netanyahu, Yonatan's younger brother, has served as Israel's prime minister 3 times, from 1996 to 1999, 2009 to 2021, and 2022 to present. Both Benjamin and his younger brother, Ido Netanyahu, have also served in Sayeret Matkal. So, back to the text. So, 3 hostages, the Israeli commander, Jonathan Netanyahu, brother of the current prime minister, all the hijackers, and several dozen Ugandan soldiers were killed. Indeed, this instance has, according to their own testimony, led several figures from the far left to distance themselves from previous activities and from former comrades. As far as the revolutionary left was concerned, Wilfried Buza and Brigitte Kuhlmann, members of the revolutionary cells who took part in the hijacking, were initially seen as victims of imperialism. Wilfried Bonifatius Boni Buza, who lived from 1949 to 1976, was a founding member of the German organization Revolutionäre Zellen that was described in the early 1980s as one of Germany's most dangerous left-wing terrorist groups by the West German Interior Ministry. Wilfried Buza carried out attacks in Germany and in 1976 was involved in the hijacking of Air Force Flight 139 that led to Wilfried Buza's death in Entebbe, Uganda, during the Israeli operation to free the hostages. Brigitte Kuhlmann, who lived from 1947 to 1976, is a founding member of the West German left-wing terrorist group Revolutionäre Zellen, RZ, or Revolutionary Cells in English. Brigitte Kuhlmann was killed by the Israel Defense Forces in Entebbe, Uganda during Operation Entebbe. So, back to the text. As far as the revolutionary left was concerned, Wilfried Buza and Brigitte Kuhlmann, the members of the revolutionary cells who took part in the hijacking, were initially seen as victims of imperialism. They only changed when in 1991 a revolutionary cell published a text titled Gerd Albertus is Dead, which detailed that Albertus, one of their members, had been executed in Syria by one of the Palestinian groups after a mock trial. It was suspected that the real reason was Albertus's homosexuality. Footnote. revolutionary cell was more of a network than a homogeneous structure. End footnote. Back to the text. This shock prompted the group to take stock of their previously uncritical support for Palestinian nationalism and Third Worldism in general, as well as look at the anti-Semitism embedded in the movement, including in the events at Entebbe. This in turn caused an extended controversy in the German radical left. This development is also left out by Herf, which makes it possible that the book can be used as a weapon against the left of any type. This can be shown to be the case with the positive review in the Weekly Standard, the flagship magazine of U.S. neocons. Footnote. The Weekly Standard is unable/unwilling to make a distinction between different strains of leftism. For the Weekly Standard, everything that starts with a C is the same. Obviously, this is not just unscientific, but straight up stupid. Unfortunately, Herf doesn't safeguard his research against such instrumentalization. Or is this Herf's intention? This would be somewhat strange, since he shared a stage among others with Stefan Grigat, Gerhard Scheidt, Matthias Kunzel, and Thomas von der Ostensacken, who are Marxist publicists as recently as June 2017. So, I think Jeffrey Herf and Matthias Kunzel are good friends. I think that Jeffrey Herf also studied in West Germany in the 80s, and as was said before, translated I can't remember, History and Structure or whatever. I can't remember what it's called, by the second generation Frankfurt School that's like non-Habermasian, by History and Structure, or whatever it is called, by Alfred Schmidt. I have stuff by Matthias Kunzel and Stefan Grigat on the channel. I don't have anything from Gerhard Scheidt, but in Werner Bonefeld, Chris O'Kane, and Beverly Best's book, The Sage Handbook to Frankfurt School Critical Theory, Gerhard Scheidt writes the entry for rackets, the Frankfurt School concept, and Stefan Grigat writes the entry for Johannes Agnoli. The one thing else I was going to say, Thomas von der Ostensacken, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name properly, but he is on a panel that was a platypus panel that took place in the pretty soon after Russia invaded the Ukraine, and the debate is very interesting because it's Thomas von der Ostensacken on a panel like full of tankies, or quasi-tankies, or like just like people who might not be straight up Stalinists, but people who like whose criticism of 20th century communism is very limited. And Thomas von der Ostensacken, in my opinion, wipes the floor with them for basically just repeating RT Russian state propaganda. Really trying to like smear the entirety of Ukrainian sovereignty by saying that there's a far right that has a political presence in the establishment, which is true literally of any other country in Europe, including Russia. Anyway, that's an afterthought, but it's like the idea is like, oh yeah, Russia should invade Poland because it has like a very prominent far right that's increasingly having power, a far right that often very much venerates Putin and the political ideas motivating him. Anyway, that's a good talk if you ever find it. Anyway, end footnote, back to the text. To sum things up, with Undeclared Wars with Israel, Herf presents a very interesting book with substantial work on the support of the Eastern Bloc, and in particular the GDR, for the war against Israel. Herf's backing this up with original and thorough research. Herf is backing this up with original and thorough research. Herf's section about the West German radical left is not incorrect, but the section is incomplete, and as such potentially misleading. The differences between different sections of the German far left and their often contradictory developments should not be underestimated or instrumentalized. What needs to be examined in more detail is the almost desperate desire of some of the radical left to find another canvas to project their anti-imperialist fantasies on after the Viet Cong slowly went out of fashion. There was a strange overlapping of open anti-Semitism and the continuation of the Nazi project to eradicate Jews with Cold War power relations. Zionists of all denominations were vilified by the Western left, despite the fact that some of the Palestinian organizations supported by the Eastern Bloc were also funded by the international far right, including the supposedly left Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which received money from Francois Genau, the Swiss Nazi banker. Francois Genau, Wikipedia says, Francois Genau was a noted Swiss financier and principal benefactor of the Nazi diaspora through the Odessa Escape Network and supporter of Middle Eastern militant groups during the post-World War II 20th century. In 1992, Genau told a London newspaper, quote, "My views have not changed since I was a young man. Hitler was a great leader, and if he had won the world would be a better place today." Genot's friends include terrorist, might be Genot. It's probably actually Genot or Genot. I don't know how to say French names, so forgive me. Genot's friends included terrorist Carlos the Jackal, one-time Gestapo agent and Interpol head Paul Dickkopf, SS General Karl Wolff, Nazi economic minister Hjalmar Schnacht, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem Haj Amin al-Husseini, and Palestinian terrorist Wadi Haddad. Back to the text. So this included the supposedly left Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which received money from Francois Genau, the French Nazi banker. A reasonable and principled response by pro-revolutionaries should be to scrutinize the history of the left and draw conclusions from it, namely in order to avoid making the same mistakes and in order to purge the poisonous and counter-revolutionary legacy of Stalinism from its ranks. Or to quote the title of the booklet documenting the discussions and controversies concerning Gerd Albertus is Dead from 1992, critique only makes us stronger. That's the end. I thank you for listening to that. That could have been a very short and brief read, but when there's a bunch of names and history being referenced that I'm not familiar with, I feel like the endeavor is the reading is limited if I'm not looking up these references. I learned a lot of interesting things about post World War II Germany and the post war Middle East as well from reading this. So from reading this and looking up the things that were being referenced. So I hope that me constantly stopping to look things up and rereading things that I already read, because in order to put the things that I looked up into context, wasn't too painful to listen to. Thank you.